Sziasztok! Izgalmas, exkluzív műsorral készülünk ma számotokra az Axióma pro-kontra műsorában. Nem klasszikus vitát fogunk ma sugározni, hanem egy nagyon izgalmas beszélgetésben volt részünk. Amerikából jelentkezik be vendégünk David Webb, aki többek között a Fox Newsnak is dolgozik. Ő fekete műsorvezetőként fog nekünk beszélni a Black Lives Matter mozgalmáról, illetve beszélgetünk az amerikai rasszizmus kérdéséről, illetve arról a kaotikus állapotról, amelyet a hírekben láthatunk. Tartsatok velünk, reméljük élvezni fogjátok. Olyan témákat is feszegetünk, hogy a nyugati ifjúságnak mik a legfőbb kihívásai a mai korban. Hello everyone, we are connected right now with David Webb, a Sirius XM Patriot host, a Fox News contributor, Fox Nation host and a columnist for the Hill newspaper. Mr. Webb, thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm doing great, and since we have the first names, you're David and I'm David. And
yeah, this is what we settled on. Indeed, we're going to have two Davids on the show, but I'm going to stick with my Hungarian form. So you're doing well. You say you're in Florida right now.
Tropical, and life is good.
Before we jump into our subject at hand, I want to look back at that notorious moment where you were actually accused of white privilege, which is a very interesting point of media history. And if you don't mind, I think it would be worthwhile to check that conversation out that you had with Ms. Ariva Martin from CNN.
Sounds good.
I've chosen to cross different parts of the media world, done the work so that I'm qualified to be in each one. I never considered my color the issue. I considered my qualifications the issue.
Well, David, that's a whole nother long conversation about white privilege and things that you have the privilege of doing that people of color don't have the privilege of.
How do I have the privilege of white privilege?
David, by virtue of being a white male, you have white privilege. This whole long conversation, I don't have time to get into it.
Ariva, I hate to break it to you, but you should have been better prepped. I'm black.
Okay, then I stand.
See, you went to white privilege. This is the falsehood in this. You went immediately with an assumption. Your people, obviously, or you didn't look. You're talking to a black man who started out in rock radio in Boston, who crossed the paths into hip-hop, rebuilding one of the greatest black stations in America, and went on to work for Fox News, where I'm told apparently blacks aren't supposed to work, but yet you come with this assumption and you go to white privilege.
David,
that's actually insulting.
It is, and I apologize because my people gave me wrong information. They told me
the whole white privilege thing is insulting.
David, can I apologize and correct the record? I want to apologize. I was given wrong information about you, and I apologize.
But based on my color, you were going to something that I was part of, and just to add to it, my family background is white, black, Indian, Arawak, Irish, Scottish. I mean, it's so diverse. I'm like the UN when it comes to this. And this is part of the problem with driving a narrative around a construct like white privilege. Privilege is one thing. We're applied wealth, economy, various social factors, but not necessarily determined by color of skin.
The golden footage. I mean, isn't this in itself a form of racism? Don't you think that?
It's a form of bigotry that we shouldn't accept. And now I chuckle about it, David. So I chuckle when I hear it. It's still popular on, if you Google me on any search engine, it comes up in the first few pages. But what's really sad, and the backstory for everyone watching, she had approached me, her team approached my show and my producers to come on my show to discuss the nomination of a Supreme Court justice. Now, when I get a request or I send out a request, I do my research on the person. I don't base it on color of skin, but what I do is I know who I'm speaking with. Because of her immediate Harvard-educated assumption that I cross from rock radio to hip-hop to urban to conservative talk. I work for Fox News, which is certainly not a left-wing network, but it's a news network. They decided, or she decided, that I had to be white. But then she went further. The dishonesty in what they do is that when challenged or faced with the facts, she throws her team under the bus and blames them for not giving her the right information. I mean, could somebody slide a piece of paper across the table and say, hey, you're talking to a white guy. Think about what she had to do to get to that point of saying, David, by being a white man, what got her there?
But why would you actually start to prepare for yourself for an interview based on the invited person's race? It just bugs my mind. Seems...
They don't like the exchange, or certainly she, I'll speak to Ariva Martin, doesn't want to exchange ideas and debate points and different points of view. She has cast a narrative. She has become, in some ways, a willing victim of her own narrative, that she has to go from that construct of, if you tell me these things, if you told her those things, she would immediately assume a white male. She doesn't have to know your color. If it was a woman telling her the same things, I would suspect she would say it's a white female.
Before we go down that path, I would like to ask you just one thing, if you don't mind that. What is this rock radio background that you were mentioning? What is this hip hop rebuilding that you mentioned?
I started out in music radio, and I started out with what was called album-oriented rock in Boston, Massachusetts. I went on to work for one of the greatest stations in America, Z100 in New York. I worked in urban format radio. I helped rebuild, and I was awarded and certainly at least recognized for rebuilding and helping to rebuild. I'll be more accurate. I won't assume. I'll be more accurate. I helped rebuild one of the great heritage black stations that launched people like Aretha Franklin, so many other artists from the 40s going forward. So I've crossed these different fields because of my interest in music, growing up knowing musicians, entertainment, actors. I mean, it's a great world out there. Let's explore it, not put it in a box.
Do you play music yourself, though?
I play the stereo. I do play the drums just a little bit. I don't have the talent, so I thought I would use the talent of learning, talking about it, interviewing some of the great musicians of all time. I've had the pleasure of traveling with some of the great bands of all time. So it's really been an almost famous story where I'm there to experience it. I've sat at a table with Elton John and had dinner while doing something for charity. I've sat with Whitney Houston, with Janet Jackson, Aerosmith, with Steven Tyler, Greg Lake, ELP. I've crossed so many areas doing a reality show with Willie D from the Ghetto Boys, a gangster rapper who actually has a good heart. And while we differed on politics, we both agreed on helping a community that was underserved. Neither one of us, back to the Ariva Martin approach, said, David, you're this, and David, I'm this, and there's no reason we can't have a common ground on helping people who need it.
This sounds so much fun. Why did you turn to politics then?
I got a phone call. I've always written. I've done some time as in the newspaper field as well. My politics were well known since college. I was co-chairman of the College Republican Club in college. I went on to always be writing, doing different things with political candidates, even working the polls at elections because I believe in civic engagement. And after years, I got a phone call in the late 90s from now a very good friend who said, I've been talking to someone about you who knows you well, and would you be interested in going to talk radio and doing conservative talk and news and issues? And that took me down the path of talk radio. So I went away from entertainment to, well, politics is entertainment in its own form sometimes.
Especially this footage was absolute entertainment. Now turning to the subject at hand, I would like to ask you to put what is happening right now in the USA into context. For us Hungarians, here in Europe we switch on the news and we see turmoil happening on the US streets, and it is rather upsetting, but I'm not sure that many people understand the background of what is happening, and it would be great to understand that. How did your society get to such a boiling point? I mean, okay, there was this brutal murder of George Floyd. However, for me at least, it seems dubious that one person's brutal killing could lead to such a turmoil. I mean, how did the US society got to the brink of such, I might say, self-destruction?
I think the word is turmoil that you use. I think it's a very accurate word. I don't think we're at self-destruction yet. We're certainly under challenge in America. But, this didn't happen overnight. One thing that united people like myself, average everyday Americans across all all parts of the political spectrum, was the murder of George Floyd. It was very clear that this was fatal police brutality. The elements of race, because of the various charges against Derek Chauvin, the police officer, now thankfully former police officer, is that we don't know whether it was race related, but certainly they had a history of some sort, and it was clearly police brutality. So people united. This is wrong. White, black, old, young, right, left. The majority of America is united. How we got to this point started many years ago, and we don't have time to go into the full history. But if you look at 2014, in August of 2014, the false hands up, don't shoot narrative that sprung out of Ferguson, Missouri, when Michael Brown charged the police officer and wrestled for his gun and the officer shot him. I covered that. I covered that in the initial phase, and then spent 2 weeks later when the verdict came out. I watched the riot, and I stood there as rioters went around me, as gunshots went off around me. What happened at that point was Black Lives Matter, who had had a small footprint, but a leftist growing movement in America, and the emergence of a more forceful Antifa element or the anarchist element combined, they all started coordinating, working together, and showing up. Now, they say they're amorphous, but they're united by their principles. Fundamentally, they're using it to take down the American culture, to destroy the trust we have in each other as citizens, the understanding that while we have differences and challenges and problems, as any nation does, that we're supposed to divide more into our boxes and then fight each other. But yet they've never showed up with a solution. They saw this with George Floyd. They decided to jump into this peaceful protest, which I support and most Americans support, became prerequisites for riots later on in the evening. It's one of the reasons I said to the protesters, protest, but at a certain point, when you see the rioting, begin, because it begins in the dark and in the evenings typically, step away so that law enforcement and Americans can see that this is not you advocating for something we all believe in, which is justice, and justice for George Floyd. We're not talking about the issues that happen, defunding the police, painting Black Lives Matter on a street, politicians taking sides, tacit or direct or outright socialist approaches by some politicians, such as a councilwoman in Seattle, who says they will work till they tear down America and institute socialism. This is a goal, and they're all using the various elements of the population in a very charged issue of the color of skin, rather than taking on the issue of where there are bad police officers or law enforcement. We should do something, and we do have a legal system for that, but they're turning it into something that it is not, and America needs to reject that more forcefully. We can no longer stand by, David. We can no longer stand there and say, you know what, it will work out, it will calm down. We really need to fight back.
Still, before we go deeper into the BLM question and issue, if you bring into a bigger context, a bigger picture, whenever America comes to mind, a lot of people immediately associate it with the Second Amendment rights, the right to bear and use arms, to keep those arms. Do you think that this contributed to the fact that maybe the police is more agitated in America, more so than, for example, in Europe or other parts of the world where bearing arms is not that easy? Do you think that could have contributed to the fact that the police work might be hindered in a way in America? What is your opinion in that issue? Do you think that the arms question and issue can be brought into this context?
Oh, it absolutely should be, and I'll use a couple of key points. In America, and while the Second Amendment and First Amendment get the most attention, our Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our protections, unlawful search and seizure, other things, it's about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I have a copy of the Bill of Rights on my wall, and what that says is that Americans believe in the rights of a legal system that belongs to all and cannot be or should not be, unfortunately, sometimes it is, polluted by anyone. So the Second Amendment rights that we stand for is about the right to do this lawfully, not about an unlawful use of that weapon. And I'll give you an example. In CHOP, Chaz, then CHOP Seattle, What you had was the rapper king Raz Simone, as I've named him, and others going out there using their weapons to intimidate the very people they claimed they were fighting for. This is the leftist approach, the anarchist approach, the Black Lives Matter approach. But yet when peaceful protesters show up, and it doesn't matter what side you're on in America, and if you're carrying your firearms lawfully, you may want to consider the optics, but there's nothing wrong with it if they protested peacefully. The Black Panthers marched in Georgia recently. I don't agree with them, but they carried their firearms legally. They didn't commit any acts. Some did try to intimidate. When you cross that line, that's where you're violating the principles under the Constitution. And to the left, let me give you some simple numbers. 393 million lawfully owned firearms, and more than that, but that's the big number in America, owned by Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, unaffiliated. And yes, there are people that are the outliers. So if the leftists think that they're going to take America in their utopian or dystopian fantasy of violent revolution, you're up against an America that stands against you. And if you look at the founding of the country, the fight against the British, the fight for freedom, the various wars that have happened, what has America done? Fought and won on the battlefield of ideas, but with superior weaponry in the cause of freedom. So Americans have that in their hearts. And that is something that stands across all political lines.
So in this problem, in this whole network of problems, do you think the actual issue is more police brutality? Because what I see from the progressive media, what I see from mainstream media actually, is that they try to pin it on systemic racism. Do you think that is the problem?
I have a question, and I'll put it to the audience, but I think you'll get the point of this. The question is a bit of a conundrum. When did you stop beating your wife or your partner? The question presents the proposition that you did, so now you've stopped. They're giving you something you can't answer, solve, or counter easily by calling it systemic racism. First of all, in order for systemic racism to exist, or institutional racism, as I spoke about at Oxford when I was there, you have to have codified law, social acceptance, and or practice. Those things have to exist. That doesn't exist in America. In America, between police and civilians, or law enforcement as an entire environment, and civilians, you have over 800,000 law enforcement officers at all levels. You have over 375 million interactions last year, all interactions, fire, emergency, domestic violence, robbery, murder, rape. Think of all the things they deal with, not all bad, but all the interactions. And of that, it is not systemic assassination or murder of blacks by officers. Once they have an issue with a white officer and a black man, they form that case around it. What happens when it's a black, Latino, Asian, Indian, as an East Indian, or any other officer? They go to the blue. It's a shifting set of narratives. It's a moving goalpost on how you actually address the issue. And it's very important that we as Americans learn not only the data, but understand that the numbers in the data and the analysis based on that is not in no way backed by the numbers, and great work by friends of mine, that is in any way that black people are being systemically targeted and killed by law enforcement. It is factually incorrect. And where there are those instances, we have dealt with them in the legal system. And unfortunately, sometimes justice is delayed. But we in America have a way to deal with that. Riots, looting, burning, destroying your communities is not a way to solve it.
How is it possible then that they so easily label it as systemic racism? Because that's what it seems that everyone is talking about that.
They have a lot of support in the media. That's part of it. And what I would call the mainstream media, I'm sure you've heard that term. Social media is a force multiplier. The minute you start something on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, especially when you have major Hollywood figures, former President Obama, presidential candidate or at least presumptive nominee Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer in the Senate, major political leaders and influencers and others diving into this and driving this narrative.
They are white people. I'm sorry, but they are white. Many of them are white people. What is the actual interest and rationale behind this?
It's a leftist ideology. Think about this. Socialism and communism, to use that example, is it about color or is it about ideology? You had the Bolshevik Revolution. They fought the socialists in a deadly civil war. The Bolsheviks won. Some 10 million Russians were killed. You have the Asian form of communism. You have the Chinese communism. You had the Vietnam, the Viet Cong and the Vietnam War. You have Venezuela. You have Cuba, just 90 miles from where I am right now. So communism and socialism are ideologies and oppressive ideologies, not about color. So those who ascribe to the leftist view, it doesn't matter what color they are, but the hypocrisy of so many of these well-to-do liberals, billionaires, millionaires, activists, actors, to come out and go back to their nicely walled homes and gated communities while they stir up violence in black communities and underserved communities outside of black communities in America. It needs to be seen for what it is, hypocrisy, and a dangerous and deadly hypocrisy.
So as a black man, you yourself, can you tell any experience when you felt on your skin that there is racism in America, or you think that is sporadic, that is occasional? Have you ever experienced racism yourself?
Not directly.
Not
Has someone
directly.
made a decision based on my color? Possibly. But I'll tell you my experience, and my experience isn't everyone else's. Are there people that have been pulled over for driving while black, or because of the color of their skin, being harassed, whatever the case may be? Of course that happens. Intellectually, I know, and we all have to be honest, racism, bigotry exists against black, against women, against older. It happens in every form. There is always going to be bigotry and form of racism, the further step from that in the world. And I'll give examples where I've been pulled over by police officers, not for being black, but how I dealt with the situation oftentimes got me out of the ticket, which is a good thing because that keeps my insurance rates down.
Tell me your tactics.
I was once pulled over by a police officer driving a sports car in my 20s. And I came around the curve off the highway very fast. I was enjoying myself. He pulled me over, came to me, ran my license, came back, said, you know what, there's a David Webb. He's 5'7", 150 pounds, 150, 160 pounds, wanted for armed robbery. Okay. Gosh. I'm not 5'7", I'm not 150 pounds, but I'm sitting in a sports car. He's looking at a close match in description, you know, facial features. And the police, you know what I do? I comply. I say to him, okay, you've got a job to do. I know it's not me. You want me to take the keys out of the engine? I'll put them here. You go do your job. He said, fine. I took the keys out. I didn't have to, but I took them out. I put it, sat back and relaxed. He went, did what he had to do, came back several minutes later, said, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the cooperation. Don't drive so fast.
I see.
He made a decision as a law enforcement officer that someone who complied with and acted in a rational manner was easier to deal with. Now, if I'd suddenly started going, well, what the hell? What are you doing? Because I'm black, really? That changes what he knows, and what he doesn't know is who I am. So now that law enforcement officer has to act or react a certain way. This is about not escalating, but being reasonable. And frankly, you're not going to win the argument with a cop right there when they're giving you a ticket, but you can go to court and fight it.
And hypersensitivity, it doesn't help in that situation either.
And that makes it even more dangerous, because if you refuse to give the officer your identification, which some have done, it's their way of resisting. Now the officer has no idea who you are. Could you be someone with warrants? Could you be totally innocent? The officer has to consider all and everything in between, because they have a job to protect the community and to do their job. Can you imagine if they don't deal with someone properly? They're a wanted criminal and they go and they commit a crime, say the next hour or next day. What happens? It comes back to that officer. There is now a responsibility. Can you imagine if somebody is murdered, because it has happened where police officers have pulled back in this environment, and it's gone on to lead to assaults, rapes, and even murder. Those cases exist. Now you have a responsibility, and can you think of the officer who says, I really just didn't want to get in trouble, ruin my career. I didn't do this, and now I've got that guilt.
I want to bring into another and maybe more delicate issue into this context, the history of slavery. Do you think that, I mean, there was a lot of incidents, racist massacres, the KKK's activities. For example, the popular show that is going on right now, it is airing, the Watchmen, or how is it called? It retold the story of the 1921 Tulsa massacre. Do you think that these hurtful events are still actively part of the black community and it affects their attitude in everyday life?
Racists exist. There's still some form of it. By the way, please stop screwing with my graphic novels. Watchmen was a great graphic novel, a great movie. Can you keep the politics out of it and not change the story of 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was such a horrible event? But you know what happened after that event was so many Americans came together. The KKK, white supremacists, no different than extreme black nationalists. They've existed and still exist in this country. They're all extremists and outside any political ideology or any spiritual belief, because they don't believe that people are people, and then there of course will be distinctions. So that exists. But our history is this. Did slavery exist? Yes, colonial slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. But look at what happened. Because of America's founding documents and principles, including Thomas Jefferson, who wanted to include that in the Declaration of Independence, but it was removed, we created a foundation to work our way out of what has been not a couple of hundred years of history of slavery, but thousands of years of slavery around the world as a principle, and slavery still exists today. I know someone who was a slave, a black man. He was a slave. They murdered his entire village in the Sudan, and Simon was gifted at age 9 to an Arab family. Simon now lives in New York. I've had him on my shows. We've talked many times. He is guarded about his experiences, but he was a slave. He was property. So it still exists, and it exists in all forms. But what did we do as America? We overturned slavery. We fought our way through the free segregation, the post-wars, the importance of those wars when blacks fought a war for freedom, came home to freedoms they were not entitled to. But that kept putting the pressure on society. So blacks and whites, the freedom riders, the various organizations that went out and fought, blacks, Jews, Irish, Italian, you name it, they exist. And because of them, we are where we are today. Not institutional, not systemic, but able to take it on. We also helped free other societies. But an example of what slavery is really about is in what happened to blacks who, after they were freed, went to Africa and founded Liberia. Because of what they knew, which was slavery, they instituted slavery of other blacks. It's an economic system using forced human labor. It has many other components, but it is not relegated to white versus black. It's just that in modern times, we have the images, the pictures, the film, the depictions. So it's able to stay more in consciousness and therefore able to be abused, rather than, as Booker T. Washington said, you know, when he talks about those who want to perpetuate it, the race and poverty pimps, those are my words. He was a bit more eloquent. But he said there are those who don't want the patient to get well. They want the troubles of the Negro to stay alive. I'm paraphrasing again. Because if the patient gets well, then you move on to other important issues.
Before we go down that path and talking about the solutions and etc., I see this mess right now that is part of American society at the moment, and I see this aforementioned figure, an actor that is somehow emerging from the masses that you have mentioned, and this is the Black Lives Matter movement that seems to, maybe these are just my words, but they seem to exploit the rhetoric on racism and slave history. We have already discussed them, but can you actually tell them who they are, what do they exactly want, who is funding them. I mean, they come across as a rather complex network of grassroots groups. Its founders are well known, and those ladies aim to push a strong agenda even on gay rights and gender ideology as well. So they seem a manifold movement with a wide range of political goals. What is your take on BLM?
Black Lives Matter is a lie in its beginning because, one, Black lives always mattered in America, or people would not have fought for freedom, black, white, or otherwise. So that's the first lie. The second lie is this modern iteration and abuse of the term Black Lives Matter, because starting with a lie, it became a way to perpetuate power in a community led by people like Al Sharpton, Louis Farrakhan, and others, the political left in America. And then in comes the communist-based Antifa, the anarchists, and others, because they need allies. Realize that they're outnumbered, so they need more and more allies, and they need cultural destruction. Black Lives Matter has not showed up after Ferguson with a solution or hard work, but I have. I am the only journalist that I know of in America, along with Sean Hannity in the initial stages and others, who went back to Ferguson. And I was back there just a couple of years ago. I took my wife to go see the town, see what had happened, and it's still blighted and in many areas. Because they don't show up. They're simply liars. They lie to you, take your energy, take your money, use you as cannon fodder, and then leave your community burnt and broken. That's not a solution. That's simply bad energy. Now you have corporate virtue signaling and companies pledging 25 million, 10 million, 5 million to social justice, the Black Lives Matter Foundation, to the Black Lives Matter website. And then you begin to ask the questions, which I do, which is, where's the bank account? Where does the money go? With over $1.6 billion pledged across all these platforms over the next 5 to 10 years, where is the money going and what is it being used for? It is going to Democrats through Act Blue, which is a fundraising technology, and then it disappears into the left politically. But do they go back to those communities? Have they been back to Baltimore after Freddie Gray? Have they been back to any other community to sit down and say, we're going to come in as an organization? You can be amorphous. The Tea Party was widespread, but more interested in doing the work and staying in the neighborhood and helping people on the ideals. They don't do that. When it's over and done, they're on till there's the next killing. And before it's even adjudicated or, whether it's murder, manslaughter, accidental, or warranted, whatever the case may be, they take it up again and they go out and they use it. What happens? Destroyed communities, destroyed businesses, destroyed livelihoods, and in some cases, dead people. There are bodies associated with that movement that didn't need to happen.
So from what you're actually saying, for me it sounds like that this has nothing to do with the civil rights movement. It is more like a social subversion. You repeatedly mentioned that they have social agendas, socialistic agendas, that they might even be communist, or maybe you have said it concerning Antifa. What do you exactly mean by that? I mean, I just don't want to use it as a word like Marxist or socialist. How are they doing that?
I'm glad you bring that up, because here's what I want people to do. I want people to look for the honest truth, the facts that exist. Antifa, 1920s, the early days of Antifa, where they acquired and where they exhibited their power. You look at post-World War II Germany, where they became part of the communist or an arm of the Communist Party within Germany. I believe that was the KDP. I may have the letters wrong there. But there was an active communist party. You look at Greek under Syriza. You look at other groups around the world. They use the term anti-fascist, but their roots and their actions are those of communists. If you can't defeat a nation, first you run an insurgency, you tear down the culture, you destroy and you fragment it, and then you rebuild it in your vision. And we have seen this happen all over the world.
How are they connected to the BLM, for that matter?
Here, you need foot soldiers. You need cannon fodder. So if Antifa was just Antifa alone, and we've seen this in other countries, in Sweden and other countries where they planted a violent footprint, there have been members that have been charged and imprisoned for various crimes. But when you come to America, and they did, they need allies. BLM is violent. It is largely uneducated because there are people that feel the passion but don't want to delve into the issues for the, the facts, the data, the things you and I are talking about, the things that the Manhattan Institute, for instance, or Heather McDonald specifically will write about. And I recommend people read her for clear distinctions based on data. So they come and they see Black Lives Matter as kindred. They tell them they're kindred, but when they're finished, what are the solutions either one of those groups propose? And what do they actually do? Is defunding the police a solution? Is destroying law enforcement a solution? None of this is. So Black Lives Matter is simply it's the cannon fodder. I can't come up with a better term because that's what they are. Go out, run, riot, protest, call for this, wear the t-shirt. They're the most disorganized, discordant group with the most organized t-shirts, signs, and technology behind them. Think about that.
This reminds me to the argumentation and line of thought that was put forward by Ben Shapiro some time before. He said that in this context, the real problem is not with race. The real problem is with culture. Do you tend to agree with that? And you said that we should deal with facts. Here is a fact. According to the statistics, the great majority, I mean like 74% of the black community, black kids have to grow up without their father. Do you think that contributes to a cultural problem that would eventually contribute to a larger societal problem?
Absolutely. When you have a stable culture with all of its differences and the melting pot approach, it's much better. But in order for culture to be stable and successful, regardless of where you come from, you have to have a good education, a good economy, and a good family structure combined. Now, in modern times, that family doesn't necessarily mean a two-parent family, mom, dad, kids, the white picket fence. That used to be the vision of the dream. It can be a blended family with a strong male figure, an older brother even, or an uncle, maybe a grandparent in the picture. In the 60s, the black family, with all of its struggles in America, it was about 80% two-parent households. Yes, with racism and segregation, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street, as it was called, all around the world, or all around the country, rather. The black family was more stable, and they were united by the struggle for more freedom. And what happened is that was fractured. So when you lose education, every time you and I read a book, what do? You open up the page, you read something new, you've learned something new. If it's fiction, doesn't matter if it's a documentary based or real life based, whatever it is, you've learned something new. Education is learning something new, but education does something important. It opens your ideas in your mind to other possibilities, that life is not simply bad or good, but there's a complex nature. So that's why education in the black community is very important, but it has been failed by poor performance rates, graduation rates that are tragic, and they create ways to matriculate out of high school, but yet there are so many black children leaving school who are unable to actually think, function at an adult level. They haven't been educated. What happens with a good education, a better family structure? You have a better chance of avoiding poverty, getting a better job, better career track, but you also have what we all learn when you grow up in a good environment. You learn to interact. You learn social integration. You integrate in your friend circle, your family circle, but certainly in your work circle. And then they all come together as you get older in some form. And then you don't fall easily, you don't fall prey easily to the race and poverty pimps or the organizations that will continually tell you, whether it's political or Black Lives Matter or others, that we care about you and you have to follow us or you get nothing. I want real black power to be blacks taking their own individual power, which becomes a group. But for decades, they've given their support to the Democrat Party. And when you give your support so unyieldingly to one party, you have no power. They know they've got you. They don't have to earn your vote, your support, and they just simply show up. Now that's fracturing, and little by little, with charter schools and magnet schools, which are heavily favored and needed in black communities, they're proving success. That it's not the color of skin, it's all the things that can be put in front of you that give you a chance to develop your talents.
This black power that you mentioned, it seems to me that some people, many people actually weirdly interpret that term, and they think that they can make up for all these problems, like the lack of a normal familiar background or normal good education, substantial support from family or a community, by going out on the streets and join the masses right now who want to, well, to me it seems, erase history. And I don't understand that, how tearing down certain statues would help them reevaluate and process what happened to them as, if we call it a race, in the past, like slavery and stuff like that. Can this all go back to the lack of education? And if so, don't you think that maybe conservatives and conservative administrations have a certain type of responsibility, that they probably did something wrong? I mean, how did it get to this point, and what do you think that maybe the conservatives did wrong in this area?
Well, there's other forms of education besides school, obviously. There's your parentage, there's your environment when you're growing up, there's even your friend circle, the school, the social circle. When you've had two generations of, you know, truly negative or lack of education or wrong education, when you read the textbooks in America, how they're very carefully written with agendas or omitting facts in the way they present it. You've created one generation, now a second generation of people who are improperly educated, which is different than just learning how to add 1 + 2, but they've been given the wrong information deliberately. So the educational part of this is what really gives you your power. Conservative, right, left, whatever the case may be, I'm someone who has fought the battles for, and with a number of organizations, for education, charter, for choice, for not being forced into a bad zip code. And we've seen the data, the results, and the people. I serve on the board of one of the oldest youth organizations in America, the Young Marines National Foundation Board. And for 50+ years, we have helped kids of all ages from 8 to 18 become better young men and women. And they have gone on. I've seen them come from poor without a television in these recent times to graduate of a medical school, a top-notch medical school in one case. I've seen so many that go on to be blue collar, white collar, no collar, military, non-military, whatever it is. So what are we giving them? We're giving them an environment that takes them out of it and puts them on the better side of the ledger. And that's what we want to do. That is a conservative principle. You own your history, you recognize your history, you teach your history, good, bad, or otherwise, because from that history you understand the evolution of a nation and a society. And that gives you a better understanding of your responsibility. David, or David, we'll get it right. You have a responsibility, I have a responsibility, everyone watching has a responsibility. It's to be better at what we do, to be better with others, to help educate as people come along in our lives, small moments, you name it, whatever the case may be, or bigger influences on children and siblings and family or whatever. Our responsibility is to do that. It's not some overly necessarily altruistic or fantastic idea. It's something so simple that we can do. But what happens when you remove that is when you get what we're talking about, which becomes cannon fodder for those who are I call them broadly the anti-American in the model of this country. We are an example. People want to come here by the millions. There are some 5 million people in the pipeline with the State Department to emigrate to America. They're still there. Why do they want to come here? opportunity, hope, a chance to be something. So think about that. How did America become that? It's because of who we really are, not who others want to say we are in the negative. And look, we have negative history. I want it told properly. You can understand it. You can understand how we got to where we are and how we keep working our way to a more perfect union.
It's interesting that here in Europe, when America comes up in a discussion, it saddens me that it seems to me that many people actually look down on America and have a very condescending attitude, especially since the Trump administration. Do you think that maybe they should have done something differently? If you have the power or even the responsibility together with that power, what would you have done differently?
Tweet a little bit less. Look, I understand the warrior spirit of the president. We're not friends, but we have many interactions, and I've known some members of the family for some time. So my bias doesn't make me wrong. Tweet a little bit less. But if you look at the actions and where he stands for America, this is a man who, when he didn't announce he was a Republican running for president, was the darling of the left in the media, a TV star, a big political donor, both sides. Suddenly he takes a side that is American, but the party is Republican in order to get elected. And what happens? He is suddenly the enemy of the people. Are you telling me that someone became, in one escalator ride, the enemy of all of freedom and everything that America stands for? It didn't. It's a committed effort to use him as a focal point, the way you would focus a magnifying glass from the sun to a leaf to light a fire. And that fire is intended to burn down America and change it. The Democrats see political power in that. They see the ability to let America be deconstructed so they can put in ideas that gets them more power. But in anywhere that I've just mentioned, did you hear solutions? Solutions are what's needed. And what the administration has done from a economic perspective and other perspectives, and even where we are now with the dangerous economic effects of COVID-19. But otherwise, what have they done? They have given empowerment to people. The housing and urban development programs under the Opportunity Zone project has literally lifted millions out of poverty into better wages, into better education, into better loans for small businesses. Things are actually being done that are not being reported properly, but it's there. So I would urge everyone, look beyond the headlines. Go look at I call it the rules, the regulations, the actions being taken, and see what's actually happening by the data. And when you look at that before COVID-19, you see underserved communities, white, black, or otherwise, rural, urban, whatever they are, doing way much better. And yes, there are still challenges. There always will be. There will always be the poor for multiple reasons. There will always be the uber successful and everywhere in between. But economic differences in success economically, that's kind of a twisted way to say it, but differences in economic levels is not a bad thing. It's because there are people that achieve different levels based on their abilities, and yes, there's luck and other factors. But where you have equality across a large part of the population in any country, you have equality of the poor. And that is certainly no way to get better equality.
That's for sure. But do you think, on more unrealistic terms, do you think that this whole chaos that you have there could be detrimental to Trump's re-election campaign?
I think it can be. I think it has an effect because there are enough, and especially in certain states where it may drive voters. And of course, with our electoral system, we have to be concerned about that. But I think there's an opportunity.
And now that we are there, I'm just asking your personal insight, whether you would feel safer under a re-elected Trump or under Biden.
Under a Trump. I have no doubt about that. And it's not just about Trump. For me, it's about the conservative principles that are there with him. For me, it's about the fact that the history and the data shows that it was the Republican Party who led and voted, not just led and talked about, but voted to enact many of the policies that have helped Americans. The suffrage movement, women's right to vote, Calvin Coolidge, Republican. Hey, they want to tear down Lincoln statues. This is the guy who freed the slaves. He got a bullet in the back of the head as a thank you.
What's that all about?
Democrat. I mean, think about this. Where the policies come from, economic policies under Reagan. You look at Milton Friedman. You look at Larry Kudlow, my friend who's now the economic advisor, Peter Navarro, Steve Mnuchin. We've all worked together. Before Trump announced he was president, we as a group, the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, went public on tax policy, on economic policy, manufacturing. Trump looked at this and said, I need the pros that have worked in this, not Democrats, Republicans, the business pros who know how the economy works globally and domestically. And these are the people that are now running, or at least advising, the president makes the final decision, but advising the president. What did we see in 3 years? Significant growth and changes across all levels of the economy.
You have mentioned that you have been involved in providing solution for these social problems to Black communities and youth. Here is an alternative solution here in Hungary. There is this progressive party called Momentum, and they sort of riding with this storm that is coming all over from the other side of the ocean. They proclaimed to stand up, and they initiated this movement called the Roma Lives Matter, based on the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you think that is a viable solution? Do you think that is what Hungary needs? That's what Europe needs to interpret what is happening with the BLM in the United States and to convert it into a European stage?
Well, I mean, I don't know them, but if it's the principle of being like Black Lives Matter, no country needs that.
Because, you know, we also have an integration problem here, a long debate, a long problem way back with the Gypsy community, with the Romani people. We have a sort of problem in society, and they stood up and they think that to convert this name into Roma Lives Matter, that would create a social discussion and a good solution for the Hungarian integration problem.
My approach on a lot of these things is to do less about sloganeering and copying something and looking at the issues. I would rather see a discussion where whatever parties are involved begin to actually meet. Community leaders, political leaders meet. Look at the issues. Look for the solutions. And by the way, not everyone always gets what they want in a solution-oriented approach. You have to give. You have to negotiate, maybe compromise to a degree. In principle, that's always been the better formula for diplomacy. And it has gotten more advancement over the course of the use of diplomacy between groups or differences, you know, people with differences, than it has when you fight each other. In principle, if you and I simply say, I say this and you say this, and there's nowhere for a discussion on what this means between us, how are we ever going to find a path forward, or at least a path to understanding, to see if there is a chance for a solution, or sometimes it's the worst case and there isn't a solution in front of you?
You mentioned that you are involved in youth communities, that you are heading an organization for the young people. I wonder, what do you think the biggest challenges for the younger generations are in the Western culture today, tomorrow? What do we have to face and how do we face it?
I think you said part of it earlier, the family structure. Mm-hmm. My foundation comes from my family, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Oh, we love each other. We argue with each other. We fight with each other, but we're family. Family's community. So that's where it begins. The education and the drive for education comes from that. And I think those core things, if they're in place, allow us to make better choices. Young people need that guidance. They also need to challenge. When I was young, I challenged what I was told. Sometimes I found out I shouldn't have challenged, and it was a little smarter if I just listened. But that's what we do as young people. And in order to help them, we've got to give them a sound foundation and the boundaries and even the border lines that are more important sometimes, that you don't go outside of this, at least until you understand the risk and are able to deal with it if it goes badly. So I'm a foundation guy. I look at these things and I say, that's where it starts. Some will become more liberal, some will become more this, more that, whatever it is. But oftentimes we're a complex mix. And we, again, back to evolution. True evolution is evolving over time as a human being for the better, hopefully, more educated in whatever you do in your life. And I think if young people have a core, they have a better chance to do that. My parents armed me with a defense, not the ability to fight. Okay, my father helped with that. He was a war hero. But they armed me with a defense of ideas in my mind. And they said, you have to be able to deal with the negatives coming at you, the positive. You need to understand it all. And we'll be here to help you when you're needed or when you need it.
What is your message to young Hungarian conservative youth who love their nation and want to protect their own national integrity?
Don't stop. Educate yourself. Don't stop. Substantiate your belief. When I was 16 years old, I had this idea. I did the research. I looked at the parties, the culture. I read the books. I'm a voracious reader. And as a result, I began to understand who I am. Understand who you are, and you may change over time. You'll change. We all will. But understand who you are at your core.
Mr. Webb, thank you for your time. I wish you all the best.
Thank you, David. See, I got that right.
Köszönöm, hogy velünk tartottatok, remélem élveztétek ezt a beszélgetést. Ha tetszett nektek, osszátok meg ezt a videót, lájkoljatok bennünket Facebookon, kövessetek a YouTube-on, hogy továbbra is folytathassuk ezt a munkát, és ilyen videókat közölhessünk veletek. Minden jót nektek!